Hi, I'm going to go through today John 28 through John 19:16. And I'm not going to do a PowerPoint today. I'm just going to go through, um, just read through it and talk through it a little bit. If we look, I'll start with, as I said, John 18:28. Then they laid Jesus from the house. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would have not delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So, just in starters, they're in Jerusalem. It's the Passover. In fact, the if you look in Cook's commentary, it explains that the Passover started on Thursday night and went through Friday night, and this is Friday morning now. So Jesus had shared the Passover meal on Thursday night. They led him from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. Sometimes we'll hear that called the praetorium, and that's the governor's home in Jerusalem, because the governor was not from Jerusalem, but he had a home there for doing business in Jerusalem. So the Jews couldn't go in that were accusing Jesus, so they had to leave him at the door. And the governor uh, took Jesus into the home and detained him there. And at the same time, the leaders were outside demanding that he put Jesus to death. He asked what the charges are and why don't they just judge him by their own law? Well, at that time, the Jews were not did not have the power to crucify anybody or to put anybody to death, rather. In fact, if the Jews were to put Jesus to death by their own law, if they were given an exception or an opportunity to do that, they would have stoned him. The Jewish law would have called for stoning. So it's interesting that it says this was to fulfill the when it says that it was not for them. The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." It means the Romans didn't give the power of execution to the Jews. They did give them limited authority to govern themselves, but that authority was limited and did not include capital punishment. So if they had killed him, they likely would have stoned him. Whereas if the Romans were going to kill him, they would do it by crucifixion, which was thought to be the most agonizing way to die at that time. And that's what it means by saying this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Because he said he would be lifted up, if you remember. So Pilate entered the headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you king of the Jews?" So an interesting thing is that the charge here is treason. But oddly, when Jesus is confronted by the Jewish leaders, they accuse him of blasphemy. So it shows kind of a hypocrisy. They're basically saying, "You're claiming to be God, and that's the reason in front of the other Jews that they're using to put him to death." But then now they're saying that he's treasonous, that he's trying to revolt against Rome. Uh, so he said, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." He's showing that he's a spiritual king. In fact, he's a king of every way. But the point here is that he's not revolting against Rome. He's not trying to cause an uproar and throw the Roman government out. "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." He's coming to do his Father's will. He's coming to bear witness about God and to bring salvation spiritually to all people. "Everyone who is the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" So this is an interesting comment. It's kind of we probably associate it a lot with postmodern type of thinking. a subjective truth. Each person has their own truth, but we can see that this thinking is as old as time here. We can see it's certainly as old as Jesus. And the idea here is that Pilate's saying there really what really is even true. After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. So Pilate's out with in the first kind of scene, if we were to call it that, Pilate's out with the Jewish leaders and they're turning him over to be arrested. They're asking him what the charges are. He goes in and talks to Jesus. He comes back out now to the Jewish leaders and says, no, there's nothing, this guy didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to let him go. But he says, you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. Do you want me to release you, the king of the Jews? So he's mocking them. He's mocking Jesus and the Jews at the same time here. And they cried out, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. So now Pilate beats Jesus, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. So now they're parading Jesus in front of the mob and mocking him and making fun of Jesus, hoping, I think, that they'll be satisfied that this punishment is enough. Pilate went out and said to them, See, I'm bringing him out to you now that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe, and Pilate said to him, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I have no guilt in him. Then the Jews answered, We have a law, and according to that law, he should die, because he has made himself the Son of God. So now we see they really are saying it's not really about his revolution against Rome here. It's about his blasphemy in their mind. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters and said to Jesus, Where are you from? So now he's seeking the origin of Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has a greater sin. This has been something that's been convicting to me, is because there's times where I've felt that maybe the people who had authority over me weren't doing the right thing. And you can see that's the case here. But Jesus submitted to Pilate's authority because he was ultimately not submitting to Pilate. He was submitting to God. He knew that God chose to put Pilate in that position for this time, and that he knew his job was to fulfill the calling that God had for him, to do the will of God. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, Behold, your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to be crucified. So this is really sad. Here we see that that now in this part, we see that, again, Pilate's trying to release Jesus, and now the Jews are basically threatening Pilate, saying that, in a sense, if you release him, then you're releasing an enemy of Rome. And now Pilate has to think to himself, well, what if they claim that I released an enemy of Rome? Will I end up paying consequences for that? And I think he realizes that he has, in a sense, he has less to risk by crucifying Jesus wrongfully than he does by potentially being politically maligned in front of his superiors in Rome, and ultimately maybe he would lose his position or even his life. In reality, he makes the mistake of being less afraid of Jesus and God than he is of Rome. And then probably one of the saddest lines in the Bible here is, it says, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. And if you think about this from a canonical standpoint, you might remember that originally God didn't will for Israel to have a king, that God chose uh, Israel to have judges, and that ultimately God would be the king, that they would have no human king. And Israel rejected that idea and pushed back against God until he relented and gave them a king in Saul. And they chose a worldly king. God installed a worldly king, and one that met all the world standards, as big and powerful and strong and smart and handsome. And ultimately, he didn't end up loving and fearing the Lord as much as he ought to have. And it led to a lot of downfall and heartache for Israel. And here now we see Israel's been replaced, um, basically put under Roman rule rather than replaced, but put under Roman rule. And now they're subjects. And now they're saying we have no king but Caesar, obviously failing to remember that they do have a king, and that king is God. And so, and God is in the flesh in front of them as king, and they reject him to be crucified by Rome. So again, we see the priorities being incorrect, a lack of revelation and understanding, and ultimately Jesus willingly moving forward. And now Pilate's handed over Jesus to be crucified.